James Pritchard vanished without a sound, but it was Elaine Pritchard's quiet, calculated lies that kept his secret buried for 22 years until their son's DNA on a coffee cup shattered everything. James Pritchard was the kind of man most people forgot after meeting. Quiet, punctual, and unassuming, he had worked for nearly 20 years as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Salem, Oregon. His colleagues described him as reliable but distant, the type who attended office parties out of obligation and always left early. The house was tidy, with no evidence of forced entry or foul play. Their marriage, she claimed, had been normal. No recent fights, no major issues. She seemed distraught but cooperative, and speaking with the media, hoping someone had seen something. With no sign of life, no financial activity, and no credible sightings, a judge legally declared him dead. The Salem PD occasionally revisited the case, but without new evidence, there was nothing to pursue. In the backyard, beneath a sun-bleached concrete patio that had been poured just weeks after James went missing, his secret waited in silence. The ground had never been searched. When police first visited in 2003, the patio was already there, a recent addition, but not suspicious enough to warrant excavation. And with no strong reason to doubt Elaine's version of events, they had moved on. The backyard became just another piece of a puzzle no one could solve. It marked the beginning of a truth buried for 22 years and set in motion, a chain of events that would uncover betrayal, lies, and a backyard grave that had waited patiently for someone to start asking the right questions. Over time, younger detectives inherited the case, scanning through the old reports and arriving at the same frustrating conclusion. James had disappeared, and no one knew how or why. In Nevada, she remarried under her maiden name and lived in a quiet suburb outside of Carson City. She never spoke of James, not to neighbors or her new husband. To those around her, she was a woman who had suffered a loss long ago, a chapter of her life she had closed and buried. She raised a son, kept to herself, and avoided attention. The past, it seemed, was behind her. He became just another face on a missing persons database, his file gathering dust among thousands of others. Elaine, who had filed the paperwork herself, cited closure as the reason. But because of a paper coffee cup dropped into a trash bin 2 states away, a careless gesture by a young man who had no idea his DNA carried the key to unlocking a decades-old mystery. She wanted to move forward, she said, and settle what was left of his estate. There was little to inherit, just a few savings accounts, some personal belongings, and whatever equity had come from the sale of the house. But tips dried up and interest faded. After a while, even she stopped coming. Elaine remained in the house, keeping a low profile. She cooperated with the occasional follow-up from law enforcement, but mostly she tried to move on. 2 years later, she sold the house and relocated to Nevada. Friends said she seemed eager to start fresh, though some noted how quickly she put the home on the market and how little emotion she showed about leaving. Inconsistent statements about what they had eaten the night before and when exactly she last saw him raised minor suspicion, but nothing conclusive. Without a body or a crime scene, the case couldn't move forward. The police searched the nearby woods, dredged a nearby lake, and even brought in cadaver dogs, but no trace of James turned up. Eventually, the case grew cold. Nothing was missing, not even James's prized watch or the cash he kept in his drawer. His bank accounts hadn't been touched. The neighbors hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, and the security cameras at the end of the block weren't working that week due to electrical maintenance. There was nothing but a dead end. At first, authorities considered the possibility that James had simply left, maybe overwhelmed by some internal crisis or fed up with his mundane life. But those who knew him found that unlikely. He wasn't the type to make dramatic decisions. He hated change and avoided confrontation. Besides, if he had left on his own, why leave the car behind? Why not take his phone or at least withdraw some money? He lived in a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, tucked between rows of similar-looking houses with neatly trimmed lawns. He had no children, rarely traveled, and hardly ever strayed from his routine. His wife, Elaine, worked part-time at a local florist shop. They had been married for over a decade, and while no one described their marriage as particularly loving, it appeared stable enough. On the morning of June 7, 2003, James vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no note, no indication of where he had gone or why. Elaine called the police later that day, sounding frantic. She said she had gone to bed around 11 p.m. the night before and woke up at 7 a.m. to find James missing. His wallet, phone, and keys were gone, but his car was still in the driveway. His work clothes were neatly laid out, untouched. The coffee maker hadn't been used. The only thing that seemed out of place was James himself. The police arrived quickly but found little to go on. Detectives interviewed Elaine multiple times. She stuck to her story. She had no idea where James went or why. James's family was devastated. His younger sister, who lived in California, visited Salem frequently in the first year, handing out flyers by the time 2013 arrived. James had been missing for 10 years. After that, James Pritchard became a name on a forgotten police file. What no one knew was that the house still held the answer. For Elaine, life moved on too. Until it wasn't, what had once been a perfectly executed disappearance began to unravel, not through some major breakthrough or shocking confession. When the FBI matched the sample from that cup to James Pritchard, it didn't just reopen a cold case, it shattered the illusion of a man who had simply walked away. In early 2025, a routine arrest in Colorado led to the unraveling of a long-buried mystery. Eric Dalton, a 21-year-old man with no previous criminal record, was taken into custody after being caught attempting to steal car parts from a downtown parking garage. Sometimes a minor arrest led to major breakthroughs. A team of agents had been working on a program to quietly test discarded items from suspects who refused consent. With Eric Dalton on their radar, they decided to keep watch. It was a low-level offense, the kind of crime that rarely sparked much interest. But when officers asked him for a voluntary DNA sample, he refused. Agents followed him from a distance. They watched as he ordered a drink, sat down for a few minutes, and eventually tossed his paper cup into a public trash bin before walking off. He had been born in 2004 in Nevada, a year after James disappeared. He had no history of violence, no substance abuse, and no major run-ins with the law until the recent theft charge. That alone changed the entire scope of the cold case. It meant there had been far more going on in the Pritchard household than anyone realized. James hadn't just vanished, he had done so in the middle of a personal crisis. After all, Elaine had been the last person to see James. She had filed the missing persons report. She had lived in the house for 2 more years, never raising further suspicion. And she had left town right after the patio was poured. And somehow, Elaine had managed to hide a pregnancy and a child from everyone who knew her. A ground-penetrating radar scan was performed on the backyard, focusing on the area beneath the concrete. A few feet down, wrapped in a weathered tarp and partially decayed, was a human skeleton. It was a carefully concealed homicide that had remained hidden for more than 2 decades. It was about motive, manipulation, and a woman who had lived a lie for 22 years. The next step was to find her and confront her with everything she thought had been buried forever. And the key to uncovering it had been a simple coffee cup tossed into the trash by a young man who had no idea his DNA would expose the darkest truth of his family. As passed, the remains were sent to a forensic lab for identification. Dental records confirmed what agents feared. It was James Pritchard. He had never left the property. What they found was chilling: irregularities in the soil, consistent with a human burial site. It was a cavity large enough for a body. The medical examiner determined the wound would have been fatal instantly. There were no other injuries. James had likely died quickly and had been buried shortly afterward. The depth of the grave, the condition of the wrapping, and the timing of the concrete all pointed to a single conclusion: someone had gone to great lengths to conceal the body. He had recently dropped out of community college and was working odd jobs. The reason for the theft was unclear, but seemed more like a desperate act than the behavior of a seasoned criminal. She had carried the child, moved to another state, changed her name, and started over, all while James lay buried beneath her backyard. His birth certificate listed a mother named Elaine Dalton, but no father. The records had been sparse, with no prenatal files in the state system. Elaine had claimed to be a single mother and had raised Eric alone until she remarried when he was 5. She had never told Eric who his father was, and when asked about it in interviews, She simply said he was an ex-boyfriend who left before the child was born. As soon as he was out of sight, the agents retrieved the cup and sent it to the lab for DNA extraction. The goal was simple: get a clean sample and rule him out. What they got instead was a startling match. That in itself wasn't illegal, but it was unusual. Most suspects complied without hesitation. That is, when they found a construction permit filed in July of that year, just a month after James went missing. It was for the installation of a new backyard patio. At the time, the work seemed mundane. Elaine had told neighbors she wanted a nicer space to garden and entertain. The concrete slab had blended in so well that even when the house was sold later, no one questioned it. Eric Dalton wasn't just a random suspect anymore. He was biologically tied to a man who had disappeared 22 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. It didn't take long for the case to be reactivated. Eric's reaction wasn't angry or loud, just oddly cautious. There were no birth certificates, hospital visits, or insurance policies indicating the existence of a son. Yet here was undeniable genetic evidence. Eric Dalton was almost certainly James's child. He seemed nervous in a way that didn't match the severity of the charge. Though there was no legal way to force a DNA sample, the FBI had a growing database to cross-reference for missing persons and cold cases. A few days later, Eric visited a small coffee shop just outside Denver. The lab flagged the result as a near-perfect kinship link to James Pritchard, a man last seen in Oregon in 2003 and declared legally dead in 2013. James Pritchard had no known children. His marriage to Elaine had been childless according to every legal and medical record available. The first question was simple: how? The second, far more troubling: why had no one known about it? FBI agents immediately began piecing together Eric's background. Eric's upbringing appeared normal. School records showed he was a quiet student, intelligent, and generally well-behaved. The FBI knew something wasn't adding up. If Eric was James Pritchard's son, it meant James had fathered him shortly before his disappearance. The team obtained a warrant to search historical property records and permits tied to the house where James and Elaine had lived in 2003, but now it raised serious alarms. Investigators began to suspect that something might be buried beneath it. The new homeowners were contacted and agreed to allow the FBI to inspect the property. The concrete was carefully removed, and the excavation began. Autopsy reports showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a single heavy blow to the head. That someone, all evidence now suggested, was Elaine. What made the case even more disturbing was the discovery that Eric, the biological son of James, had likely been in Elaine's womb when the murder occurred. As the puzzle came together, the FBI realized this wasn't just a case of a missing person. The evidence was mounting quickly, and the case was no longer just about a man who had disappeared. Elaine Dalton was living in a quiet cul-de-sac in Carson City, Nevada, when federal agents arrived at her door. She answered with calm politeness, dressed in a sweater and jeans, her gray hair neatly tied back. There was no hint of alarm in her expression. To neighbors, she was known as the quiet woman who kept to herself and took morning walks with her husband, Gerald. She volunteered occasionally at a local library and lived in a modest, single-story house with a garden she tended daily. By all outward appearances, she was a normal middle-aged woman enjoying a peaceful life. What the agents knew, and what Elaine didn't expect, was that the skeleton found beneath the patio in her former backyard had shattered the long-standing mystery of her first husband's disappearance. One entry asked how long it would take for a body to stop smelling if buried under cement. 2 weeks before James disappeared, he had canceled his life insurance policy. There had been no replacement filed, and Elaine had received no death benefits. At first glance, that fact had made her less suspicious. After all, she gained nothing financially from his disappearance. They reconstructed a theory. James found out Elaine was pregnant with another man's child. He may have been asleep, or Elaine may have struck him during an argument. She simply carried on, smiling at neighbors and returning to her job. And then, once the dust had settled, she quietly disappeared from the community and restarted her life as if James had never existed. Either way, it wasn't an accident. She had then wrapped his body, buried it beneath the garden, and within days hired a contractor to pour a patio over the site. Next step would be to take Elaine to trial and uncover even more of what she had worked so hard to bury. But already, the most important truth had surfaced. James Pritchard hadn't walked away. He had been silenced. And now, after 22 years of pretending, Elaine would finally have to face what she'd done. How could the woman who reads stories to children at the library and brought lemon bars to block parties be capable of murder? But the evidence was undeniable. A coffee cup carelessly discarded had led investigators straight to a buried body and the woman who thought she had outsmarted time itself. At the time, no one questioned it. A backyard renovation in the summer wasn't unusual. She even invited neighbors over for a small get-together once the concrete dried. Furious and betrayed, he may have threatened to leave her and take everything with him. Maybe he confronted her, demanded a divorce, or planned to reveal the affair. Elaine, knowing that such a revelation could ruin her, reacted not with guilt, but with cold calculation. But further digging revealed that James had also started making inquiries about divorce attorneys just days before he vanished. One name in his address book, now long out of service, belonged to a law office that had shut down in the early 2000s. They had no record of him, but the timeline was enough to suggest intent. She didn't confess immediately, but her behavior shifted. She asked for a lawyer. She stopped answering questions. But her silence didn't protect her anymore. The body, the digital trail, the lies, the DNA, it all told the story for her. Another searched whether a person could be declared legally dead without a body. She had sold off a few of James's possessions through local ads without informing his family. She told friends he had left her emotionally long before he vanished. No one questioned her version of events. She had managed to present herself as a grieving, abandoned wife, and she had played the role so convincingly that even the local detectives at the time didn't. T pushed too hard. These were not the casual curiosities of someone browsing the internet. They were targeted, desperate, and chilling. The DNA match from Eric Dalton had triggered a chain of investigations that led straight to her. Elaine had never mentioned the pregnancy to police, friends, or James's family. She had given birth in a neighboring county under her maiden name and listed no father on the certificate. At the time, no one connected the dots. Elaine had moved within weeks of giving birth, changed jobs, and left Oregon behind completely. She created a new identity built on silence and omission. Her new husband believed Eric was adopted. Eric himself had never questioned the gaps in his story because Elaine had always claimed she didn't know much about his biological father. Yes, she'd lived there many years ago. Her first husband, James Pritchard, had disappeared, and it had been a difficult time. She didn't remember much anymore, she said, just pain and confusion. She had moved to Nevada for a fresh start and didn't want to reopen old wounds. But her answers were too polished, too rehearsed. She avoided specifics and changed subjects when pressed. And now they were there to gather the final pieces of the puzzle. Not because they expected to find a murder weapon or physical evidence after all this time, but because they wanted access to the things. People often forget old papers, computers, and digital traces that might tell a different story. In one box, tucked among books and personal letters, they discovered an old laptop wrapped in a towel. The laptop hadn't been used in years, but the FBI's cyber team managed to access its hard drive. What they found confirmed their growing suspicions. They began by asking questions, casual at first. They brought up her past residence in Oregon. Elaine responded with faint detachment. What Elaine didn't know was that investigators already had a warrant to search her home. Inside her garage, agents found several storage boxes filled with belongings from her time in Oregon. There were saved internet search records from June 2003 searches related to decomposition rates, concrete drying times, and crime scene cleanup methods. Elaine's financial records from that period also painted a darker picture. At the same time, Elaine had quietly been withdrawing cash in small amounts, avoiding attention. But the real crack in her story came with Eric's birth. Eric Dalton had been born 5 months after James's disappearance. With the DNA match now placing James as Eric's biological paralogue, investigators realized that something must have happened in the days leading up to James's death. The autopsy confirmed James had died from a single blow to the head with a blunt object. There were no defensive wounds. It was likely he never saw it coming. The horror of it all lay in how ordinary everything seemed afterward. Elaine didn't flee or panic. Now, confronted with the evidence, Elaine's calm began to crack. News of her arrest shocked the community. Those who knew her in Nevada were stunned. What had begun as a minor theft in Colorado had pulled on a thread that unraveled a secret kept hidden for over 2 decades. The trial of Elaine Dalton became one of the most closely watched courtroom dramas in recent memory. By the time it began in the fall of 2025, the headlines had already spread across the country. The skeleton found under the concrete patio had been crucial, but it was just the beginning. Forensic scientists confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. The skull fractures were consistent with a heavy household object, possibly a cast iron skillet or a fireplace tool, something readily available in most homes at the time. Many testified that Elaine had portrayed James as cold and emotionally distant. She painted herself as a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, deserving of sympathy. But none of them had ever heard her mention that she was pregnant when James disappeared. That omission, prosecutors argued, wasn't just suspicious, it was strategic. Elaine had erased part of her history to create a cleaner version of her life story. Some theorized she had felt trapped and had acted out of desperation, while others described her actions as cold and calculated. The jury heard from one expert who described Elaine's behavior as consistent with someone who planned a crime to escape consequences, not someone who acted on impulse. Elaine showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. She was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her second husband filed for divorce shortly after. Eric, now carrying the weight of a past he never knew he had, chose to leave Nevada entirely. He told reporters he needed time to understand who he really was, away from the shadow of his mother's choices. Her ability to live a normal life for over 2 decades without ever revealing the truth was a key point. She had buried her past along with her husband and had kept the secret so well that not even her second husband knew she had been married before. Though the weapon had never been found, the nature of the injury suggested it was a sudden and deliberate act, not a scuffle or accident. She sat still, her expression unreadable, as the prosecution gave its closing arguments. They reminded the jury that this wasn't just about a body in the backyard. For 22 years, she had lived freely, carrying a secret she thought would never be discovered. But justice had found its way. Not through confessions or eyewitnesses, but through a piece of trash dropped into a bin by a young man, who had no idea the blood in his veins carried the key to a buried past. It was about a life taken, a truth hidden, and a woman who thought she had escaped justice. They emphasized the evidence, the timeline, the cover-up, the lies, the DNA. One by one, the pieces formed a clear picture of guilt. Now 21, he had spent his life believing he was adopted. They claimed James could have died in an accident, that perhaps Elaine panicked and made a terrible decision by hiding the body. Investigators showed that she had immediately begun selling off his belongings, told people conflicting stories about his last days, and refused to engage with his family. She hadn't held a memorial. She hadn't contacted his workplace to report him missing. James's employer had to reach out to her. And most damning of all, she moved out of state within months, changed her last name, and never looked back. They suggested someone else might have been involved, the mysterious man she had allegedly been seeing at the time, who had since vanished. Maybe James confronted them both and things spiraled out of control, but it was a weak argument with no proof. There were no signs that anyone else had access to the home, and the affair partner had never resurfaced. His mother had never told him anything about his biological father, other than vague references to someone who couldn't be part of our lives. Learning that James Pritchard was not only his father, but also a murder victim had shattered his sense of identity. He testified with pain in his voice, recalling how his mother had always been protective but distant, never willing to share much about the past. When he found out his DNA had led the FBI to James's body, he felt betrayed by the very person he trusted most. The story had every ingredient the public couldn't resist: a missing husband, a backyard burial, a secret child, and a break in the case that began with a discarded coffee cup. Though he had canceled his life insurance policy shortly before his death, He had also met with a divorce attorney. The prosecutor revealed that he had been planning to leave Elaine after discovering the pregnancy. Friends had described James as a deeply traditional man, and learning the child wasn't his may have shattered whatever was left of their already strained relationship. The theory was that Elaine feared losing everything: her home, her stability, and the future she had imagined for herself and her unborn child. People were captivated by how such a horrific crime could remain hidden for so long, masked by the image of an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. The prosecution spent months preparing, gathering every piece of evidence that connected Elaine to her husband's murder. Elaine's internet history on her old laptop painted a picture of premeditation. Investigators recovered search queries made days before James vanished: phrases like "how to kill without blood," "burying a body in the backyard," and "can dogs smell through cement?" Though Elaine's defense team argued these could have been curious clicks or unrelated searches, the timing was damning. Combined with the sudden construction of the backyard patio and the unexplained pregnancy, the jury was left with little doubt that she had been preparing for something sinister. James's financial records added another layer to the motive. Witnesses were called from Elaine's past former neighbors, co-workers, and even friends she had confided in over the years. Even more telling was how she had raised Eric. He took the stand reluctantly, visibly shaken by the entire ordeal. The defense tried to argue that there was no direct evidence linking Elaine to the murder. Even Elaine's behavior after James's disappearance worked against her. Psychological experts were brought in to discuss Elaine's possible state of mind. In her final moments on the stand, Elaine chose not to testify in her own defense. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The story of Elaine Dalton became a cautionary tale about the lies people can live with and the truths that eventually surface. The courtroom had gone quiet after the verdict, but the impact of the case rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Elaine Dalton, once an unremarkable woman in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, had now become the face of one of the most shocking cold case breakthroughs in decades. Her mugshot circulated widely, plastered across newspapers, television reports, and social media feeds. People across the country struggled to understand how a woman could kill her husband, hide the body for over 2 decades, raise their child in secret, and carry on as though nothing had happened. What disturbed many the most wasn't just the murder. It was the silence. Elaine hadn't confessed. He had believed her completely when she said she'd been widowed young and had adopted a child on her own. Their marriage had lasted over a decade, and he said he never once suspected she was lying. After her arrest, he spoke briefly to reporters, describing her as reserved, private, and often emotionally distant, but never violent or suspicious. The life they built together had been, in his words, an illusion. He filed for divorce the day after her sentencing and never visited her in prison. She hadn't written a letter, shared a word, or hinted at guilt. People were fascinated by how such a simple object, a coffee cup, had unraveled such a tightly concealed secret. Though many described the breakthrough as a lucky hit, it was their instincts that turned a minor theft case into a headline-grabbing murder investigation. The new owners decided to demolish the patio entirely. They built a small garden in its place and planted a tree in James's memory. A plaque with his name and the years of his life sat at the base of the tree, reminding anyone who passed that, even in the most peaceful neighborhoods, terrible things could happen. The neighbors respected the space, often leaving flowers, especially in the spring when the tree bloomed. And in the end, no matter how long it took, the truth had found its voice, not through those who spoke, but through the one who had stayed silent for too long. The decision to follow Eric Dalton and collect his DNA without his knowledge had been entirely legal, and ultimately, it was the reason James Pritchard was finally found. One of the lead agents later commented that the case reminded him why no file should ever be fully closed. You never know when technology, timing, or one careless mistake might blow it wide open. The case was held up as a modern example of how forensic science and data could catch killers who thought time was on their side. It was also a warning: no secret stays buried forever. His disappearance had once been a question without an answer. Her silence was her final statement, and maybe her only act of consistency. She had chosen to erase a life, rebuild her own, and leave behind a trail of unanswered questions. Now, it served as a symbol of perseverance for his sister, for investigators, and for those who never stopped searching for the truth. Some remembered the day she poured the concrete patio behind the house. He had grown up thinking his father had abandoned him, or worse, that he had never wanted him. His mother told him little and made sure he had no questions to ask. When she finally told him the man on the birth certificate wasn't his biological father, she described the story as unimportant. She claimed the man was no one worth knowing. Eric had accepted it until the FBI showed up. She had never given up on finding out what happened to her brother, but she never expected the truth to come from a discarded coffee cup. The idea that a simple coffee cup had shattered the life he thought he had was surreal. He stopped talking to most of his friends and deleted his social media accounts. He moved out of Nevada within a week of the trial ending. Reporters tried to reach him, but he refused interviews. Those closest to him said he was struggling with the weight of a legacy he never asked for. For years, she'd feared he might have left voluntarily, that maybe he wanted nothing to do with his family. And his mother, the woman who raised him, had lied every single day of his life. To learn that he had been murdered by the very person he trusted the most and then hidden in his own backyard was a devastating revelation. He wrote a brief statement to be read aloud in court. In it, he said he hoped to build a future based on honesty, even if that meant turning away from everything he once knew. He expressed sorrow, not anger, and hoped that the truth would at least bring peace to those who had suffered for so long in silence. During her victim impact statement, she described the pain of knowing her brother had died alone, discarded like garbage and buried without dignity. What hurt the most, she said, was that Elaine had lived freely while James's memory slowly faded into obscurity. They'd never suspected anything sinister. She'd hosted a barbecue just weeks later. A few guests had stood right above the spot where James Pritchard was buried, laughing and sipping iced tea, unaware that death lay just a few feet beneath them. That memory would stick with them for years to come. Even as the evidence mounted, she remained eerily composed. That silence, the complete lack of remorse or recognition, haunted those who had once known her. Her former neighbors in Salem, Oregon, where she and James had lived in 2003, were stunned. James's sister, Mary Ann, had flown in from California to attend the trial. Elaine's second husband, Gerald, was equally blindsided. But perhaps no one was affected more deeply than Eric Dalton. For 21 years, he had lived without knowing who he truly was. The discovery that his DNA had not only linked him to James Pritchard, but also led to the discovery of a murder, was too much to process. He had not only lost his biological father, he had unknowingly helped uncover the truth of his murder. Eric didn't attend the final sentencing. In the months following the trial, true crime documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube videos dissected the case in detail. The FBI agents who had worked the case were praised for their persistence. Back in Salem, the house where James had once lived sat quietly. James's legacy, once reduced to a cold case file, was now etched into history. And Elaine, now serving life in prison, remained silent. No apologies, no confessions, no explanations. But the past had a way of surfacing, even from under concrete.